Welcome back to Beyond the Scoreboard. I would like to begin today's episode with a question that has challenged me throughout my coaching career. Who are your athletes when you are not there? Not during practice, not during games, not when you are standing 5 feet away watching every repetition. Who are they when the coach is not watching? Do they still arrive early? Do they still work with purpose? Do they still choose discipline over convenience? Do they still hold themselves accountable? Or does the standard quietly disappear the moment the coach leaves the gym? The older I become, the more I realize those questions matter far more than any offensive system or defensive philosophy. Because every coach has influence while they are present. The real test of leadership begins when they are absent. When I first started coaching, I believed one of my responsibilities was to maintain control. I wanted organized practices, attention to detail, immediate responses, quick corrections. Everything looked disciplined. But over time, I began asking myself a difficult question. Were my athletes becoming disciplined? Or were they simply becoming obedient? Those are not the same thing. Obedience depends on someone else. Discipline eventually belongs to the individual. A player who only sprints because the coach is watching hasn't yet developed discipline. They have learned compliance. A player who continues working when no one is watching has begun developing ownership. That difference changed the way I think about coaching. Many of us spend years trying to control behavior. We create rules, consequences, expectations, schedules, standards. Those things are necessary. Every successful program needs structure. Structure alone is not the destination, it's the beginning. The purpose of structure is not to create dependence. It is to help young people develop habits they eventually choose for themselves. That to me is the real purpose of coaching. When athletes first arrive in our program, they borrow discipline from us. We remind them to be on time. We remind them to communicate. We remind them to compete, prepare. We remind them to recover properly. For a while, that's exactly what they need. But if 4 years later they still need someone else to remind them to do the right thing, then perhaps we have unintentionally created dependence instead of growth. The goal of coaching has never been to make athletes dependent on the coach. The goal is to help athletes become independent enough to hold themselves accountable. That transition doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually. Day after day, conversation after conversation, habit after habit, eventually something begins to change. The coach stops reminding. The athletes begin reminding each other. The coach stops demanding effort. The team begins expecting it from one another. The coach no longer protects the standard alone. The players begin protecting it themselves. That's one of the most rewarding moments in coaching, because at that point, the culture no longer belongs to only to the coach. It belongs to the team. I have come to believe that many coaches unknowingly confuse control with leadership. Control usually asks, how do I make them to do it? And leadership asks, how do I help them want to do it even when I am gone? Those are completely different questions. One changes behavior for a moment, the other changes habits for a lifetime. Perhaps that's why the greatest measure of a coach is not what happens during practice. It is what continues happening after practice is over. Because eventually every athlete leaves, every season ends, every coach walks away. The question is whether our athletes listened while we were there. The real question is whether they continue living by those standards after we have gone. To me, that's where coaching truly begins. If we agree that the goal of coaching is to develop athletes who eventually lead themselves, then the next question becomes obvious. How do we actually build that kind of environment? I don't think ownership begins with a speech. It doesn't begin with a list of team rules posted on a locker room wall, and it certainly doesn't begin with fear. Ownership begins the moment athletes stop asking, "What does coach want?" and start asking, "What kind of team do we want to become?" That shift changes everything because standards no longer belong to one person, they belong to everyone. One lesson coaching has taught me is that people protect what they help build. If every standard comes only from the coach, then the standards leave with the coach. But when athletes help create those standards, something different happens. The expectations become personal. Now, they aren't following rules because they were told to, they're protecting something they believe in, and that's ownership. One of the mistakes I made early in my coaching career was believing that leadership belonged mainly to captains. Leadership belongs to everyone. Every athlete influences the environment. The athlete who arrives early influences the culture. The athlete who refuses to complain influences the culture. The athlete who encourages a struggling teammate influences the culture. Even the athlete who chooses to cut corners influences the culture. The question is never whether your players are influencing the team. The question is what kind of influence they are having. That's why I believe every coach should spend less time trying to create leaders and more time creating opportunities for leadership. Sometimes that means asking players to solve problems before the coaching staff steps in. Sometimes it means allowing experienced athletes to mentor young teammates. Sometimes it means asking the team difficult questions instead of immediately providing every answer. Growth often begins when responsibility is shared. I have also learned that accountability is much stronger when it comes from inside the team rather than outside it. Now think about it. A coach reminding an athlete to sprint harder is expected. A teammate asking for greater effort carries a completely different weight. But why? Because it shows the standard now belongs to the group, not just the coach. That's when culture begins to take on a life of its own. Of course, none of this happens accidentally. It requires intentional leadership. Athletes need clarity. They need to understand not only what is expected, but why those expectations exist. People commit much more deeply when they understand the purpose behind a standard. Because running isn't simply about conditioning. Being on time isn't simply about avoiding punishment. And communicating isn't simply about following instructions. Because each habit reflects something much bigger: respect, discipline, commitment, trust. Those values become the identity of the program. And identities are always stronger than rules. The rules tell people what to do. Identity shapes who people become. Perhaps that's why the best teams I have been around never depended on a coach to protect the culture. The players protected themselves, not because they feared consequences, because they believed the culture belonged to them. That to me is one of the clearest signs that a coach has been successful. When excellence is no longer something demanded from the outside, it becomes something expected from within. And once that happens, the coach is no longer carrying the team alone. The team begins carrying itself. As coaches, we spend years thinking about what we can teach: how to improve shooting, how to defend better, how to execute on offense, how to prepare for competition. Those things matter. They are part of our profession, but the older I become, the more I find myself asking a very different question. What will remain after the athlete leaves our program? Like, not next season, not after graduation. 10 years later, will they still prepare with discipline? Will they still keep promises they make to themselves? Will they still be accountable when no one is checking? Will they still choose integrity when shortcuts are available? Because eventually every athlete enters a season when there is no coach waiting at the gym. No one checks whether they work out, or they prepared, or they treated people with respect. Life eventually becomes the greatest coach. And life rarely reminds us to do the right thing. That's why I believe coaching has always been about preparing people for freedom. Not freedom from standards, freedom to choose the standards they want to live by. It's a completely different way of thinking about leadership. Too often we would love to ask, how can I get my athletes to do what I want? Well, perhaps a better question is, how can I help them become the kind of people who no longer need me to remind them? Well, that should be our goal. Not dependence, independence. Not control, character. Because character is simply discipline that no longer depends on supervision. One of the greatest compliments I have ever heard a coach receive wasn't about championship. It wasn't about wins. It wasn't even about basketball. It was simply this: Coach, I still hear your voice when I make difficult decisions. Think about that for a moment. Not because the athlete is afraid of disappointing their coach, but because the values they learned become part of who they are. And that's influence, that's education, that's leadership. I often think we underestimate how much of ourselves we leave behind in the people we coach. Not through speeches, not through motivational quotes, but ordinary moments. The standards we refuse to compromise. The way we respond after losses, the way we admit mistakes, the way we treat the last player on a bench, the way we speak out about officials, the way we respect opponents, the way we remain calm under pressure. Athletes are always watching, long before they remember what we thought. They remember who we are. Perhaps that's why coaching begins with self-leadership. If we expect accountability, we must model it. If we expect honesty, we must practice it. If we expect discipline, we must live it. Because athletes can usually recognize the difference between standards we believe in and standards we simply talk about. In the end, every coach leads, every athlete graduates, every season finishes. The banners remains on the wall, the stats are archived, the trophies gather dust. But somewhere, former athletes continue living their life. Some of them are going to become teachers and parents and coaches and business leaders and mentors to the next generation. And without even realizing it, they begin passing on some of the standards they once learned inside your program. And to me, that's the true legacy of coaching. Not creating athletes who depend on their presence, creating people who carry your values into places you will never go. As we close today's episode, I would like to leave you with one final question. When your athletes leave your program, what do you hope they take with them? Your offensive system? Your practice plans? Your favorite drills? Or something much deeper? Well, the ability to lead themselves? Maybe the courage to hold themselves accountable? Or the discipline to choose what is right when no one is watching? Because if they leave with those things, then your coaching didn't end with the final whistle. It became part of the way they choose to live. And perhaps that's the greatest victory any coach could ever hope to achieve. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Beyond the Scoreboard. Until next time, remember this. The measure of a coach is not what athletes do while the coach is present. The measure of a coach is what athletes choose to become long after the coach is gone.